My name is Dr. Jackie Wright. I'm the Director of Environmental Risk Sciences. It's my own company and I've been operating that company for around 14 years. I've actually been doing human health and environmental toxicology and risk assessment for almost 30 years, actually over 30 years. And we look at lots and lots of different chemicals and whether they're safe for the community or the environment. So a human health risk assessment is a tool that we use to assess whether any exposure that we have to any particular chemical has the potential to result in an adverse risk to human health. And when we do that, what we have to understand is how we might be exposed to those chemicals. So that how we might be exposed might come from our food, our water, through the air, and we might be exposed through ingesting it, through breathing it, or it might go through our skin. But we also have to understand the toxicity of that particular chemical, whether it has the potential to cause various different health effects and at what type of exposure level causes those health effects. So we have to understand those things and then we combine them together to understand whether our exposure is low enough to make sure that we wouldn't be adversely affected by those chemicals. So we want to make sure we're safe from those types of exposures. So that's the sort of thing that we look at in a health risk assessment. Now, when we do a health risk assessment, we have to follow guidelines. Now, Australia has guidelines for how we do these types of assessments. They're established by NHealth, which is a federal health department, and they are endorsed by our state regulators. So the health risk assessment that we undertook for the ARC is specific to that particular project, and it's focused on emissions to air. So it links in really well with the air quality assessment that actually models and predicts the emissions to air and the impacts of those on the community surrounding the project. So from the air modelling, what we've taken are predicted concentrations of all the various different chemicals in the community surrounding the project. So it's really important to cover off on a cumulative assessment because when we're assessing health, it's about the total intake of those chemicals into our bodies from all the ways we can be exposed, not just from the ARC, but from all the other pathways as well. And to make sure that our total intake is safe. So it's less than a threshold, for example, or a safe guideline that's protective of health. We want to make sure that all of the chemicals that come into our body are low enough that it doesn't cause a health effect. So the outcome of the health risk assessment that we did found that there are no impacts on community health from the project. And when we say that, we mean that when we look at inhalation exposures, that all the concentrations that we would be exposed to are well below health-based guidelines that are protective of everyone in the community. And when we also look at the other pathways like the soil and the water and going into crops and food produce, that they're all below health-based guidelines and they're all designed to be protective of everyone in the community. So there are no adverse impacts on community health. The area surrounding the ARC has a lot of farming and livestock and crops. That's part of the community that we have to assess. And we looked at the impact of the emissions from the ARC impacting on those crops, and we found that there are no impacts on those crops. We can do a calculation, but the concentrations that we predict are so low that you would never be able to measure them in any of those produce that would be grown. So if you own a farm in the area that surrounds the project, you don't need to be concerned about any of the impacts that come from the ARC project impacting on any of the quality of your produce that you would either consume yourself or sell. To further illustrate what I've just talked about, this particular graph focuses on dioxins that might be predicted in various different fruit produce that might be grown around the ARC project. Now, Australia doesn't have food standards for dioxin levels in our produce, however the European Union does. So they have levels for meat, milk and eggs. So those are the blue bars that you see on the graph. They're the safe levels from the European Union. Now, what we've predicted going into produce that is grown around the area from the ARC project are in the orange bars, which are really, really small, and they're a tiny fraction of those safe guidelines. Rainwater tanks are an important aspect to look at, particularly for this community where drinking water sources come from rainwater and rainwater tanks. So we looked at the deposition of dust that contains metals and some organics onto the roofs of houses and then washing into rainwater tanks, and we made a bunch of conservative assumptions to work out a concentration in the rainwater tank from that process occurring. And we then compared them against drinking water guidelines. So drinking water guidelines are the concentration in water that everyone in the community can consume safely every day for a lifetime. The particular graph that you're seeing here shows with the blue bars what the proportion of that drinking water guideline would be that comes from that deposition on the roof and accumulation in the rainwater tank. So it's actually a very small fraction. In fact, all of the metals and organics are well less than 1% of the drinking water guideline, which is a negligible contribution. And it wouldn't change the existing water quality that's in those rainwater tanks. And in fact, the levels are so low that you would never measure them if you undertook water quality testing of your tank. When we do any health risk assessment, we undertake a very rigorous process that looks at the exposure side, but also the toxicity side. And in particular, the toxicity side, we understand a lot about the adverse health effects that might occur from exposure to the various different chemicals that we look at. And we rely on really detailed, peer-reviewed assessments that are internationally accepted. So that's a really rigorous process that we use to make sure that we're protective of human health. But also wrapped into that are a range of safety factors that are incorporated. We also take a conservative approach to actually understanding how we might be exposed. So we make sure that we're doing things with plenty of margins of safety in there, and the outcomes that we have also have a margin of safety. So that means that there's room to move. If things change a little bit, that's still fine. If things change a little bit, there's still plenty of safety to make sure that everyone remains safe and health is protected.